Well, Brianna, thank you for joining me in this conversation about communicating with our kids. I think it's such an important subject to talk about. And as a parent myself, I can often feel confused about what are the best ways for me to communicate with my child. And I want to make sure I'm having that balance of structure and rules and boundaries, and also focusing on empathy and connecting with my child and making sure that I have that attachment with them. So, share with us a little bit about the work you're doing, um, a little bit about your life and the work you've been doing as a therapist.
Yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation too, because there are so many different things to keep track of, right? And then there's events happening in life. So we're trying to connect and empathize and set boundaries and create structure and model stuff for them. And it gets complicated. So I'm excited to be talking about this with you too. I am a therapist and I live in Macon, Georgia now. I grew up in Papua New Guinea. And so my work is online and I work with missionary kids, diplomat kids, kids whose parents work in NGOs and they're international. And so sometimes they don't have local mental health resources where they live at all, or what they have is mainly focused on all different issues and what they have going on. So that's part of my niche, is working with those kids who are abroad or who have returned and are dealing with that cultural transition. But I also work with kids who have gone through sexual abuse too. I used to work at a child advocacy clinic before I went into private practice. So I really like walking alongside families as they go through figuring out what to do about that and what to expect. So um, that's kind of what I focus on. And
And I think you bring up a really interesting point too, that I think about. Parenting has different rules in different cultures. And
yeah,
so we're probably going to be focused a little more on American parenting and what our rules are here, what the
mhm,
cultural expectations are. And yet there are these expectations, but how do we make sure that we're being healthy parents, and knowing what are the positive ways that we could be communicating with our child to make sure that they're feeling grounded and connected to who they are.
yeah, you make a great point there that there's so many different cultural ways and methods of parenting. And one of the things I think is common across cultures, but varies in the degree of intensity, is respect for adults. So,
Mm,
like, I moved from Washington State to Georgia, and one of the big differences here is um, people use ma'am and sir a lot more. Like on the West Coast, the only people doing that are people in the military. And
right.
that's how you know some a family's in the military. If you hear somebody say ma'am, you're like, oh, military family. um, and down here in Georgia, I don't have my kids say ma'am or sir at home, but they do at school. So um, I we just talk with them about the different ways of showing respect to adults. And a kid can easily get misunderstood at school if they're showing respect in a way that doesn't mean respect to the person who's they're talking to,
Mhm,
or remorse also. If
mhm,
they're showing they're sorry in their own cultural or just their own personal method,
mhm,
that other people are missing, that they're displaying that in some kind of way. Like, I think adults often expect kids to show that they're sorry when they're getting them in trouble. And if they're not understanding that the kid is showing that they're sorry, they can be really upset and punish them more, like lift up the levels and levels, like, I'm going to show you you're sorry. The
right,
kid
right.
already is. That can create catastrophic miscommunication, the child feeling really unseen and then reacting badly to that feeling.
Mhm. And that reminds me of curiosity. I mean, it makes me think of how I always go back to curiosity and joining with that child and asking them how they're experiencing this situation, and
Yeah.
balancing that with also educating them, helping coach them on
Mhm.
how do you think that other child is feeling? How would you feel if you were in that situation?
Yeah. And these things take time. I think that's one of the biggest things I would want to remind parents of, is you've got much more than the moment it's happening
Mhm.
to work with when you're talking with a kid about what happened.
Mhm.
Um, if they're talking to you about it in the moment, that's super impressive. And much more commonly, though, you can talk with them about it in advance. You can talk with them about it afterward or later and later and later. um, like, hey, this reminds me of the time, or just randomly out of the blue. Like kids are very often, and adults too, are sensitive to being called out on stuff, and they
Right.
can get defensive easily in the moment if they're physiologically aroused and they're in still the physical experience of being upset. Um, it takes a lot of self-control to be able to talk about what's going on while you're upset. And
Mhm.
we can expect that maybe of mature adults, but for kids, we want to help them get there. But meanwhile, we're going to be talking to them after they're done being upset, however long that takes, and say, kind of out of the blue, hey, remember when this was happening? And kind of like, I just imagine sneaking up and pouncing on them with it when they're just not worried about it. And then their guard is down in a good way.
Right. Right. Because that makes me think about fight or flight.
Yeah.
And when we can get into that survival mode, when we see our child doing something that, ooh, that's not a good choice that they're making, that feels like it reflects on us. And it is our job to help model for them, coach them, teach them how to have those healthy interactions with others. And
Hmm.
so if we're having that reaction, they're definitely having that fight or flight response where they're
Yeah.
more emotionally driven and reactive. And I think, like you said, we need to be aware of that and make sure that we're giving them the right time and the right resources to calm down and to learn how to self-soothe. How can they take that break? I work a lot with younger children. So how can they physically walk away, calm down, take a break, so then you can have that conversation later?
And every time you're having that conversation later, you're modeling approaching conflict in
Mhm,
in a calm way,
mhm.
because then whatever you do, they're likely to do, for better or worse.
Right.
So as much as we can stir in things that we want them to model,
Mhm.
uh, we're doing a great job at teaching them how to be. And it may be us even more than them sometimes that needs to take a day or 4 hours or 3 days or however long it takes, like not so long that they don't remember what you're talking about.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
if we can come at them really gently in a moment when neither of us are agitated at all, that's the very best place to be talking about it.
Mhm. And that when I think about what are those things that I wish every parent would know about communication, that that's one of those important things, the shaming language or the shaming behavior that we might be modeling for our children
Yeah.
and we don't realize it. When
Hmm.
and I think about babies and young children, and when you're out in public or around certain parents, and um you hear that name calling, or you hear somebody say, stop being bad, or stop being a baby, or stop
Yeah.
being dramatic. I think the parent is trying so badly. They're trying to come from a good place. They're trying to
Hmm.
teach the child that's not appropriate. There are other ways that we can behave or respond to what's going on around us. And at the same time, that's a shortcut. The parent is trying to get the child to conform and do the thing that they want them to do.
Yeah.
But when you pull back and think about the long-term effects of some of that shaming behavior, the child isn't given the chance to really slow down and think about what's happening.
Hmm.
They're being reactive to the parent now. They're having to do what the parent wants them to do. And
Right.
later on, that doesn't always result in the child learning respect or learning how to interact appropriately with peers or other children.
Because they're taking that cue from the parent who's being really direct, but they're not learning how to observe from the environment what's required of them next.
Mhm. Yeah. And sometimes you even see that child start doing the same thing to their peers where they might think,
Yes,
this
yes.
is how I'm supposed to respond to somebody that's bothering me.
Mhm.
I'm supposed to shame them or name call or get aggressive in some way
Mhm.
when the parent didn't intend to teach that lesson
Certainly
or
not. Yeah.
that behavior. But we have to think about, how are we communicating to our child? Are we using this shaming language that is teaching them, I need to do what you want me to do? Because
Right.
shaming language can be scary, and it can teach children, okay, I need to listen to my parent, or I need to do exactly what this person wants me to do,
Mhm.
rather than learning, how can I pay attention to how I'm responding in this situation so that I can then choose to be the person I want to be.
And we wanna be the kind of people we'd want our kids to end up with later in life for their families.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's might be kind of a freaky way of looking at it, but like if you're thinking about talking to your son or daughter, think about like how would I like it if their future boyfriend spoke to them in this way or their future girlfriend spoke to them in this way? Would I want them to think, oh yeah, that's just how people and families normally talk to each other? Or
Mhm.
would I want them to be like, oh, this is different. I don't like this. This is out of my comfort zone.
Right. Right. And I think that is how people end up in those situations where they aren't happy, they aren't in healthy situations,
Mhm.
because they've been conditioned to believe, I need to do what other people want me to do. I
Mhm.
don't need to pay attention to how I feel in this situation or how that other person is treating me. How do I want to handle it? And that is the greatest question, the most powerful question we can ask our children is, how do you want to handle that?
Right.
It shows support, it shows compassion that we're with them, we're walking with them, and it slowly builds confidence for them to know that they can handle conflicts, to not be afraid of conflicts.
I like how it builds in from the start that there are ways that you can handle it
Mhm.
and you have options. And that's the expectation that you'll think about your options when you're in a challenging situation. It's
Right.
great how it just kind of naturally builds that in there because if you tried to take that apart and convince the kid independently of any of those elements, like especially a teenager who wants to kind of spar with you on an issue,
Mhm.
um, which by the way is kind of it's a healthy place for teenagers to be, to get to be sparring with parents about, like, well, what about this, or how about we look at it this different way? That's great. It's great showing off of their brain skills.
Mhm.
But for little ones, or when you want to not spend time in the sparring activity at that moment, the way you phrase that is really great because it builds in just the assumption. You've got the options, you've got choices. It also gets them into their thinking brain. It kind of brings that blood to the prefrontal cortex where it's away from the fight and flight area at the back of the brain, driving all the muscles and the blood flow and into the I gotta think and calculate and weigh options and look at my skill set. Which of my skills do I want to choose to use here? One of the things that we could talk about is how to communicate with kids and what to do with them like in the moment when they're really upset.
Mhm.
And one of the couple of the things that have been really working well for me lately with my 3-year-old are to go to timeout with him. And we have a spot that they can go to that they calm down. They sit on the mat in front of the door because there's not a lot to distract there. But when I sit there with him, he might be shouting at me. He might be not wanting to pause and take deep breaths. He might be trying to throw shoes around. These are things he does. But if I'm there with him and I'm not doing those things, I'm showing him how it's done.
Right.
And I think taking deep breaths when you're upset is so important. But a lot of times kids do not want to do that when they're upset.
Mhm.
So if you're close enough to them that they can hear what you're doing with their breath, sorry, too bad, kid, you have mirror neurons and you're going to start breathing slower just because you can't help it. So we can kind of, again, like just sort of stir that into their experience, whether they like it or not. And we don't
Right.
have to force them to take those deep breaths. If we're there with them while they're upset doing it, it
Mhm.
becomes part of their experience and that it will grow into something they do naturally.
And you're planting those seeds.
Yeah.
You're actively teaching them and you're modeling for them, this is what it looks like to calm down. This
Hmm.
is not a punishment. I'm not punishing you and abandoning you in this moment.
Mhm.
I'm actively joining with you and coaching you, and I'm in this with you. And at the same time, it's also your responsibility to slowly build that muscle, to
Yeah.
learn how to manage your actions and reactions and emotions.
And I don't know if this would work for every kid, but for our son, our younger son who's 3, having a visual of how much longer this time is gonna last is really helpful for him. He calms right down when he sees with his eyeballs that there's an end to this time that's designated for calming down.
Right.
He just sort of just we've practiced taking deep breaths outside of the moment, again, just like you would do with a sport, right? You have practices before you get in the game.
Mhm.
So he knows how to do it, and when he gets the ability to focus his attention on something other than how mad he is, like the visual on a cell phone of how much longer this time is gonna last, um, he has that built into his experience. He takes his deep breaths without trying to, and then he calms down really quickly. So, we don't always have the coordination to get that going,
Right.
um, but if we know it's gonna be really difficult for him to calm down, that's something that we know we can do.
So how long would you go to a timeout or take a break with your 3-year-old?
Um, Sometimes 3 minutes, but he often doesn't need that long. Sometimes 90 seconds to 2 minutes is long enough for him,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't do it too much longer than 3 minutes because he may still be upset, but that's been a long enough time for him to calm down enough that he can go back successfully into the game and do something different than whatever the problem was before.
So when you're with your child and y'all are calming down, what do you see in him, or what do you see in his behavior or his emotions that okay, he's back in his body, he's back to feeling a little more clear on who he is, and he's ready to go back?
He's pretty easy to tell because he's really demonstrative when he's upset. When he stops throwing the shoes, when he stops kicking his legs, when he stops screaming, then he's better.
Right.
So,
I think a great question for us to think about with communication and interacting with our kids is, what is our long-term goal? Are we
yeah.
trying to teach them how to follow all the rules that we're sharing with them and that we're implementing with them? And yes, that's probably part of it.
Mhm.
Um, and at the same time, how do we have these dual roles going on with our kids? We're connecting with them. We're creating that stability for them, that emotional, um, we are that emotional base for them.
Yeah.
So, how do we connect with our kids in that way and also say, no, that's not working? No, that's not safe. I think that's an internal struggle many parents have is I want to love them and show compassion to them, and I want them to like me. I want
Yeah.
to be in a positive place with my kids. And yet we can see the negative effects of only saying yes or not having those boundaries and rules.
Mhm.
And then if we're so far on the other side where we're so strict and only saying no and we're so rigid with our rules, we can lose some of that emotional connection. So I think about that tension that we feel as parents. I know I feel that um, in the day to day. Like,
Mhm.
how do I balance both of those things, that connection and the boundaries?
Yeah, I think it's another part of that balancing is consistency, but also flexibility. Like sometimes I will ask my 6-year-old to do something and he gets really upset about it.
Mhm.
And once I figure out why he's upset, I go, "Oh, okay, yeah, I see your point now. I see why what I asked you to do was so dang upsetting." And then I can say I can reserve the right. It's kind of on the one hand, you might look at it, so sometimes people interpret it as weakness, but we can also just look at it as flexing our power to reserve the right to change our own minds when we feel like it.
Right.
And also model like, oh, okay, now that you've said that, I think differently about it too. And I think we could also get done what we need to get done if we do it differently. So
Mm.
sometimes we'll negotiate. And my 3-year-old is actually really great at negotiating. He is just naturally inclined that way. But I think we want to encourage our kids to negotiate within, like, respectfully and within reason.
Mhm.
Um, and we can show them where the ability to get what they want ends,
Right.
if it's outside the bounds. But um, I like it when my kid's like in the bathtub, they don't want to get out yet.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
negotiating for like, what can I give you your toothbrush now while you're still in there? So that we can still move forward towards bedtime, but you can stay in the water longer.
Mhm.
And um, then, after a while of kind of offering trades and compromises, they get in the flow of that and they'll make suggestions on their own, which sometimes are pretty outlandish in no way, and sometimes
Mhm.
they're pretty good. And
Right.
it's takes, I think, a little bit of humility and flexibility for me to try hard to go with their suggestions when they're within reason,
Right.
because I really want to encourage them to do this communication thing. If somebody's asking you for something you really don't want, um, but they have a point, where they're trying to get,
Mhm.
how can we get there with everybody glad about the process? I want them to think that way and get good at that.
Mhm. And it gives them a little dose of healthy power.
Yeah.
They wanna feel like they're participating in our family. They wanna feel
Mhm.
like they have a role, that they're contributing in some way, and we
Yeah.
might not even realize that as parents, but these little ways that we can listen to them and really respect them, because often I think we can overlook that they're little humans that deserve to be respected and listened to, and their feelings are real. And oftentimes I'm blown away by the valid points my 6-year-old makes too. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And
Mhm.
and I can change my mind. I don't have to always be right as the parent just to be right.